I'm John Sewell. I'm a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, and we're glad you're all here. This is a remarkable event, and I'll say one or two words to that in a minute, but I wanted you to know that this meeting, of course, is sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which many of you may know is literally the monument to Woodrow Wilson, who, of course, was one of the first presidents to have a PhD and run a university. And it was set up by Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others when he was a senator to be the living monument to Woodrow Wilson. So it is a quango, a quasi-non-governmental organization roughly attached to the Smithsonian. The program, Wilson Center on the Hill, is a program meant for all of you who are congressional staffers or associated with it as a way of being able to interact with experts, scholars, people from outside the United States on a whole broad range of international affairs and development issues. It's sponsored by, funded by the Hewlett Foundation, for whom we are quite grateful. But I only want to introduce three people who can stand up. One is Kent Hughes, who's director of the PAGE program, under who this works at Wilson Center. One is David Klaus, who is where? He's not here. Who actually runs the program himself, and Elizabeth Byers, his assistant, who many of you have talked to and met, who I assume is still standing outside for latecomers. This is a really remarkable event, the release of the QDDR. Liz, I just mentioned your name, so you are recognized. The unveiling of the first quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. From my perspective, it's the first major change in U.S. development policy since the reforms of 1973, a long time ago, and sets a course for American foreign policy for the future. So you're going to hear about what American foreign policy will be shaped in the rest of the Obama administration. Our two speakers are, of course, Anne Marie Slaughter, the director of the policy planning staff at the Department of State, and Don Steinberg, who is deputy administrator of AID. You've got their bios in the handouts that were given to you at the meeting. Dr. Slaughter is winding up the QDDR and will return to be head of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Be a loss to the State Department, but a gain for the Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton. And I will turn the platform over to her. She's going to speak for 20 minutes or so, and then Don will speak, and then it's open to questions and answers. And because of all the delays, we'll run this till 1:30 or so. If you've got to get out to meet with your boss, don't do it. It'll be much more interesting to stay here. Anne-Marie?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I just have to say, as the former dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, I will not be going back as dean, but happily as just a professor, we think there is at least one more monument to Woodrow Wilson, but we are very happy to be here.
I said in Washington.
You did. Well, Lee Hamilton and I used to joke that, not that we seem to be anything alike, obviously personally, but we would go around the world and have people come up to us and say, oh, I spent a year at your institution, and like as not, it was often the other one. But I've had the pleasure of serving on the board of the Woodrow Wilson Center as Secretary Clinton's designee. I think the work that the center does, particularly the bipartisan, nonpartisan role that the center plays in advancing work that is policy relevant, is enormously important. So this is a particular pleasure to be able to address all of you on what is definitely now, bar my wedding, the birth of my children, et cetera, the second best day of my life. The QDDR is finally out, and I will start by saying you should go to state.gov/QDDR. Not very hard. You will find the executive summary, you will find fact sheets, and you will find the 200-page report, which I'm certain all of you will want to take home and read over Christmas. So with that, let me at least give you the highlights in ways that I hope will help us have a conversation. I will talk through the chapter on diplomacy and the chapter on conflict prevention and response, and give you a very brief overview of the final chapter on working smarter, and then I will turn to my colleague Don Steinberg, who will summarize what really was one of the animating desires of this report, which is how do we elevate development and how do we strengthen USAID once more into the premier development organization in the world. Secretary Clinton started the QDDR to ask the question, how can we do better? That effort was inspired by her service on the Armed Services Committee as a senator who oversaw the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, and who saw every 4 years the Department of Defense coming in and saying, okay, we've lifted our heads above the inbox, we've looked down the road, we've figured out where we need to be today to be ready for tomorrow, and we have assessed what we're doing well, and we've assessed where we need to improve, and here are our conclusions, and when we ask you to appropriate funds for us, we can tell you how they're being spent and how we are thinking strategically and how we are planning looking ahead. I don't think I do any disservice to my current institution to say that is not the first thing people thought about in terms of the State Department. We've had a different culture, and we obviously do plan, but the nature of the events we work with means we have been less able to do this kind of systematic work, and that's the first thing that she wanted to change. In that, how can we do better? There are a number of different answers broadly. One is, of course, we can be more accountable. We can be more transparent. We can be more efficient. We can be more effective. That's just working better overall. And all the way through the QDDR, you will see that there is an effort to everywhere we can, whether it's reducing the number of reporting requirements on diplomats in the field, whether it's streamlining our planning and budgeting processes, whether it's working better regionally. There's an emphasis on how do we do this not only better, but more transparently and in a more accountable way. Then there are, I think, three broad substantive answers to that question. And the first is to be really effective and to do what we need to do to advance our security, our prosperity, our values, we must lead with civilian power in the 21st century. That civilian power must be the first face of American power, supported by the world's finest military. This is in no way civilian power versus military power, quite the contrary. It's saying we need to build our civilian power to be able to do all the things the military can't do, and to be the partner, frankly, that the military needs, where we need to work together in the field. But from the nature of the problems we face, whether that's a pandemic, whether that's fighting violent extremism, whether that is looking at energy security, all the different issues we face, most of them have to be addressed by civilian power, and civilian power is a great investment. And here the military is also focusing on prevention rather than response. This is, if you invest in civilian power, you can reduce the costs of our power overall around the world. The second thing to say about that, we are not defining civilian power only as state and USAID. We are saying that the civilian power of the United States is the power of civilians across all federal agencies. One of the biggest changes in my lifetime in foreign policy and foreign affairs is that virtually every agency that was once a domestic agency, from Health and Human Services to Environmental Protection to the Department of Justice, across the board now engage in relations with their counterparts around the world. They have to get their jobs done. That's the nature of globalization. But that's been coming a long time, but we have not integrated it into how we conduct the management of America's foreign affairs. We have still thought of that. We're the State Department, and USAID does the development. And there are all these other things going on, but we're not pulling them together as American civilian power in the world. And yet, the opportunities are enormous. Just aligning these different agencies will yield huge benefits. In many ways, it's never going to be an aircraft carrier. It's never going to be one, but it could be a flotilla. It could be at least going in the same direction, right? Even if you're getting there in a different way and under your own steam, absolutely. We're not going to be telling other agencies what they do, but we are going to be providing the strategic framework that says, here are our overall foreign policy objectives. And you know, if you do this in the health area or the justice area and that actually cross-cuts, or you miss the opportunity to have a synergy between your programming and another agency's programming, we are missing opportunities. We'll provide that framework, and our ambassadors, who of course are the President's representative, they're not the State Department's representative, they're the President's representative, will oversee the work of multiple agencies on the ground. In addition, so that's on the diplomatic side. On the development side, that is the role of USAID, where Don will talk about how that changes the way USAID does its business, but fundamentally USAID provides the development strategy, the strategy of how to cooperate with the government. And again, there are many, many agencies in that space. So that's civilian power as the broad answer to how we do better on the diplomatic side. Second answer, or set of answers, is around elevating and transforming development. Secretary Clinton said when she was here for her confirmation hearings that one of her goals as Secretary of State was to elevate development as a core pillar of American foreign policy. This is the blueprint to try to do that within the framework of the Presidential Policy Directive on Development. And finally, conflict prevention and response. Again, investing in prevention. Investing in prevention saves money and saves lives. It is hard. Often you can't see when you succeeded, exactly because the conflict didn't break out, but we can actually point to places where we have avoided conflicts that were very clearly on the horizon. Here again, if you read the QDR, you will see that the Department of Defense is equally committed going forward to building partner capacity, to building strength. On the security side, we talk a great deal, not just about security assistance, but security and justice sector assistance to strengthen governments around the world and to invest very specifically in building that expertise. And then finally, as I said, there are a set of reforms that go to simply doing what we do better internally, and I'll come to those. So if those are our broad answers, let me give you some of the specifics under each one. Now again, let me caution you here, because people have already been writing reports based only on the executive summary. It's a 200-page report. There are many, many, many reforms. Many of them are quite small, although you all will know that they have big implications. Often getting down to the nitty-gritty is where you have to go. We're not going to put those in the executive summary, but they're there. So I really do urge you to read the report. This is a very broad overview. In the diplomatic, in the chapter on diplomacy, civilian power sounds great. Many of you have been in Washington far longer than I have. Interagency collaboration is one of those things we say when we want to be more efficient and more effective. We're making it real. And we're making it real in some very specific ways. One is, first place, to have this report endorsed by the interagency, which it has been. There are many agencies that very much feel that they would work better if they worked within a broader framework, if we were more coordinated, if we were more aligned. But then we are asking other agencies to have our chiefs of mission be part of the evaluation, the performance reports on members of other agencies who serve within their countries. On the flip side, we are telling our personnel that to be selected as a deputy chief of mission or a chief of mission, you will be evaluated in part on how well you work with the interagency and whether you've spent time at another agency or taken a course in what other agencies do. We can't do this if we do not embrace and know about much more the international activities of what all of our sister agencies do. Simply doing the traditional business of diplomacy, which is very important, is not enough. So we are building this in at the level of basic incentives. The other thing we're doing is committing to other agencies that we will turn to them when we contract before we turn outside. Now, there are legal restrictions on this, so I do not want to say that we're just automatically saying to the Department of Justice, yes, you will do it and we will never turn to outside contractors. No. But we are saying we're going to build a presumption in, to the extent we can by law, that says if we can have Justice Department officials who are doing police training or rule of law work and who are building relationships with their counterparts who will become future ministers of justice or chief prosecutors or judges, that's an asset for the United States. Those are the relationships we need to build. We have always built them diplomatically. Now we need to build them across the government. But that's an asset that we need to gather, to harness, and the experience. You know, what works, what doesn't work. If that goes to private contractors, and of course it will continue to, you're not going to end contracting, but that we lose that. So we are actually formally committing to enter into interagency agreements to shift this presumption. Then there are a set of reforms around how do we organize ourselves to be able not to work with other agencies much better and to simply tackle the global problems we face. Here's the place where, when I talk about this in the State Department, and I've briefed this to every single bureau, and Don and I have talked to every chief of mission and every aid mission director around the world to make clear this is not just a report. This is something we're going to be implementing. Everybody leans forward when you get to the org chart, right? Everybody, this is where people, are very concerned. But we didn't start with the org chart. This is not just, well, we got to do something, so let's move the boxes around. This is really about how do issues naturally group together in the context of the 21st century in a way that if we organize ourselves that way, we will get much greater synergies, we'll be much more effective, but also where the trade-offs that need to be made can be made. You need to have the same issues. For instance, if you're talking about the environment or you're talking about energy or the economy, those involve trade-offs, and those trade-offs should be made under the same undersecretary. Two big groups of issues. One is really around how we protect individuals. Increasingly, and this is a global trend, it's certainly not just the United States, we are focusing not only on states, but on individuals in advancing our interests around the world. How do we protect individuals from violence? That's conflict prevention and management within fragile states. That's a new Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But similarly, law reform, international law enforcement, narcotics, that's protecting individuals from criminal violence, which, if you're on the other end of it, it really doesn't matter who's holding the gun. It's still fundamentally providing basic security for individuals. But we also, of course, provide security through law. We advance, just as we do here, through human rights and democracy. And if there are crises, we meet individuals' basic human needs. If you add that up organizationally, it comes to an Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. Under that Undersecretary will be a new Bureau in Conflict and Stabilization Operations, in International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Population, Refugees, and Migration, Trafficking in Persons, and Global War Crimes. Those are the organizations, the bureaus that will be under that Undersecretary. On the other side, global systems. The department, the Undersecretary for Democracy and Global Affairs was created in the 90s really to focus on the environment. But once you think of it as global affairs, it's odd that the economy wouldn't be the place you start, given that's most globalized system. So the Undersecretary now for Economic Affairs becomes the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. And within that is a new Bureau for Energy Resources. Energy resources addressing energy security, energy access, power sector regulation. This is something Secretary Clinton has wanted to focus on from the beginning. It cross-cuts security issues and development issues, and it means working with other agencies a great deal. Also, under that Undersecretary, the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, and the Science and Technology Advisor. And the two energy coordinators will go into the Energy Bureau. The last two things we are doing is we will be coming to Congress to ask for a new Bureau for counterterrorism. All the other bureaus, I know those of you obviously who work here are thinking, well, can they do this? The answer is yes. We do have 2 open assistant secretary slots to create the Bureau for Conflicts and Stabilization Operations and for Energy Resources. But we need to come to Congress to ask to convert the coordinator for counterterrorism, Ambassador Benjamin, into a bureau. He has 100 people working for him already. So this is not about building a whole new bureau, but it is about building that into what the State Department does, making it easier for him to work with the military, with the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, all the different agencies. So we are asking for that. And then we will also be appointing a coordinator for cyber issues who will have work with others across the government on cybersecurity, but will also work on confidentiality of privileged communications. All right, let me turn to, there's another set of recommendations around engaging beyond the state. This is something Secretary Clinton has also been very actively engaged in, really encouraging our diplomats and rewarding them, not only for meeting with our government counterparts, but working much more actively with people and organizations in their countries. I want to make sure we have time for Don to talk, so let me fast forward to conflict prevention and response. Here, the biggest change is really embracing conflict prevention and response within fragile states as a core diplomatic mission. That if you are a young Foreign Service officer, you're going to spend part of your career in a fragile state, in a state where there's a very weak government and a very high potential for a nexus between that weak government and violence over resources, violence over ideology, whatever it is. We need to embrace that as a core mission, and to do that, we are taking, again, we'll be working with Congress here just to convert the coordinator for stabilization and reconstruction to a Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. We'll be building expertise. There's a whole body of expertise on how you work within fragile states that has been emerging as we gain from experience. Then we will also be focusing on how you get these folks into the field much more quickly and effectively, which is something Deputy Secretary Liu spent a lot of time doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. There again is expertise in USAID, in the Office of Transition Initiatives. We'll be working closely with them. But these are fundamentally political issues, and we need to develop our ability at least to guide and to work with other agencies to get people into the field. Last thing I'll say there is we've developed a lead agency approach between state and USAID that says, depending on the crisis, one of us will be the lead agency, the other will be supporting, we'll both be out there, we'll both be doing what we do best, but somebody has to ultimately coordinate. State will coordinate in security and political crises. USAID will take the lead in natural disasters, industrial disasters, famines, epidemics, all of those kinds of issues, and we'll both be in the field. Last thing I will say, going to the Working Smarter chapter, there are personnel reforms. Don will talk about some of those. We will be coming to Congress to be asking for your help here to make USAID able to do what it needs to do. There are reforms around contracting, making insourcing and improving oversight of contractors. And then there are finally a whole set of reforms about how we plan and budget and measure our performance much more systematically and in a way that allows the Secretary to set priorities, have those priorities go out to the field, have the field do much more streamlined but also much more integrated planning, have that come back, and the key, get tied to the budget in ways that then can be monitored by all of you and by us to see how we're actually doing. And we have frameworks for monitoring and evaluation, and again, Don will be talking more about that. So with that, let me turn to him on the elevating and transforming development.
Thanks, Anne Marie. I have actually been at USAID all of 2 months now, and so I feel like I'm the relief pitcher who gets to come in at the end of the game, and when we win, I get champagne, or iced tea, as it were. But it really has been a pleasure working with Anne Marie on all of this, and one of the key results of the QDDR is a much greater understanding between state and AID at all levels, and insofar as we've engaged the interagency as well, a much greater understanding, cooperation, a sense of community in our efforts. At AID, we believe that the QDDR really does represent a vote of confidence from the President and the Secretary of State in the capacity of our organization to lead on development and to run the most important presidential development initiatives. You have to look at the QDDR in the context of the President's policy directive on development that he announced a couple of months ago. And if you look at that document as well as the QDDR, it basically identifies 3 important points. First, that development matters. It is in our national security interest. It is in our national economic interest. It generates jobs, which I guess is pretty important these days. And it also reflects our values. And so it isn't just something that's nice to do. It is a fundamental part of defending this country, ensuring our national security, ensuring our economic security as well. Secondly, the document says, in effect, someone's got to be in charge in development, and that's USAID. And so it talks about how to provide a leadership role for AID and how to empower AID to play that leadership role. And finally, it says that if those first 2 factors are to be achieved, we need a new business model. We need to be doing things in different ways. We need to be applying our scarce resources with the depth and the scope that's necessary to really create game changers on the ground, to create sustainable development. We need to be looking at accountability provisions. We need to be looking at how we can ensure that science and technology is incorporated in everything we do. And it basically says we can't be all things to all people anymore. We're not in Lake Wobegon, where all children are above average. We have to apply some selectivity in this area. And indeed, the QDDR says there are 6 things that we should be prioritizing. The first 3 are presidential initiatives in global health, food security, and climate change. And in addition, we prioritize economic growth, democracy and governance, and humanitarian response. And then if you sort of view this as a 6+1, the +1, which is a cross-cutting requirement, is related to women and girls who need to be empowered, who need to participate fully in all of our efforts, who need to be protected in some conflict situations, not as victims, but as survivors. And we need to focus on mainstreaming in all of the above initiatives. And in this case, mainstreaming really does not mean sidelining, as it too often does. The QDDR has been, in effect, a 14, 16, 18-month process, and it's...
Not 18, 16.
Okay. And we keep being asked, well, now that the document is out there, are you going to start implementing it? And the truth is, at AID, we've already started implementing this. It would have been irresponsible as we come up with clear needs to wait until December 15th, 2010 to go ahead with them. And so I wanted to review a couple of the things that we're doing at AID under what we call the USAID Forward Initiative. All of these things are identified in the QDDR as important initiatives, but again, we're already, on the road to implementation. The first is reestablishing our policy capability. As you may know, in 2006, AID formally gave up its policy formulation office. And in fact, the link between policy and budget had been cut many, many years before that. I like to think of USAID during that period as with the Wizard of Oz, that we still had courage, we still had a heart, but we didn't quite have the brain we used to have. And so this is part of the process of reasserting AID's capability. And what we're doing with that office already is looking at the new generation of issues that are out there. We're looking at the youth bulge. We're looking at education for the 21st century. We're looking at water and the relationship between water and conflict around the world, for example. The other thing that we had lost was our budget capability. With the transfer of our budget capacity to the State Department with the F Bureau, again in 2006, we didn't have the capability to put together a budget, to analyze what that budget did, and to include all of our planning capabilities into that effort. Well, over the past year, we have reestablished the Office of Budget and Resource Management, brought on some very talented staff, and the reflection of that confidence in that office is that the QDDR says that in FY13, for that budget, AID will prepare its own comprehensive budget that'll be submitted to the Secretary of State and the Deputy for their review and incorporation into the broader budget that is put forward for foreign assistance to OMB and eventually to Congress, and that we are being given vast new powers in terms of actual execution of that budget. And I stress this in particular because I've heard many people say that an organization that doesn't control its own budget capability doesn't really control its own mission. And so this is coming back. We've set up a center for innovation. We brought in AAAS fellows. We brought in Franklin fellows. And we're applying science and technology as, frankly, never before at the State Department. We've begun to, at AID. I spent 30 years at the State Department, and old habits run deep. We have begun to reform our procurement efforts. You have to understand that AID from 1990 to 2007 lost 40% of its staff. Basically, the bottom line was that we had moved largely from a development agency into an assistance agency. The goal was to get money out the door. And we signed huge contracts with contractors. Not only did we have them do the actual operations, we had them do the planning, the program design, and we had them do the evaluation. So they were planning our programs, implementing our programs, and then telling us how well they did in terms of the implementation. And that has to stop. And so we have brought in substantial new staff to take over those functions and change the way we've done procurement. Additionally, and this feeds on what Anne-Marie was talking about, we have expanded our capacity to partner with the many U.S. government agencies that are involved in foreign development issues, as well as expanding our capability to work with other donors, multilateral institutions, civil society, and the private sector. And we brought in new staff. And we have a very serious demographic problem at AID right now. A third of our people have been on the job for less than 3 years, and yet 95% of our senior staff could retire tomorrow at full pension. And that just creates this middle level problem of leadership. And so what we're doing is bringing in more mid-level hires, doing it in a responsible way, but still addressing the concerns that we have there. We're going to be asking for something called Schedule B hiring authority, where we can bring on people through that technique. As I've said, we're bringing in fellows. We're also creating what we call a super grade of Foreign Service nationals overseas, so we can bring in PhD economists and doctors and other very highly skilled people and pay them what they deserve. All of this effort is symbolized as well in a decision in the QDDR to provide USAID a leadership role over the two big initiatives that are in our development field. And so the QDDR says that immediately, i.e. today, USAID will provide leadership and accountability for the President's Feed the Future initiative. We're going to have a coordinator based at USAID who reports to the administrator and the Secretary of State, and we've created a large bureau for that purpose. And secondly, USAID will assume leadership and accountability for the President's Interagency Global Health Initiative with a transition target of the end of FY12 as we achieve certain benchmarks. And I think this is really significant because, as you all know, over the past decade or so, all of the big development initiatives that have been announced by the President and implemented, such as MCC, have gone elsewhere. They haven't gone to USAID. And this is a reaffirmation of the confidence of the President and the Secretary of State that AID is capable to run these important presidential initiatives. Let me just conclude by saying that we at AID take this very seriously. We know that with empowerment comes responsibility, and the key responsibility in this area is to adopt the watchwords inclusive leadership. We need to reach out to our interagency partners within the U.S. government, to the private sector, to NGOs, to foreign governments, to NGOs operating in foreign countries, etc., in a new spirit. We cannot be aid-centric anymore. We are the development advisors at missions overseas. We can't be turf conscious anymore. We're not going to be rewarding people for how successfully they guard their turf, but how successfully they implement the development challenges of our government. And that does require people to work cooperatively with all of their partners. We believe the QDDR is a powerful document, but it's really only as powerful as we can make it. And let me assure you, we intend to make it powerful indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now open for questions. Now, this session is run for congressional staff people, so I give them priority in questions, which, because of time, we can only run till about 1:30. And just tell the speakers who you are, as they haven't had a chance to meet everybody. Who would like the first question?
And if there are questions for me, I only have about 5 minutes, unfortunately. So, and just for the record, I really prefer like true or false questions or multiple choice. Okay. and if it's multiple choice, give me an E, none of the above. So.
Okay, so the floor is open. Who would like to have the first question or comment or? No, you've danced with them. I don't. No, in the far back.
Dan Harsh.
Stand up so everybody can hear you.
Dan Harsh, White House Foreign Affairs. I apologize if you mentioned this in your remarks, but we were all engrossed in our BlackBerries as we just lost a rule for the tax cuts. So, on AID's budget, are you going to be submitting your own budget to OMB directly, or is this going to go to state? Can you sort of detail how you're going to work with state to develop the 150?
Yeah, it's very clearly set out in the document itself, and there is a lot of arcane budgetary type language. But to summarize, our missions overseas will be preparing their country-specific budgets, sending them obviously with the concurrence of the ambassadors, but sending them to AID, our Office of Budget and Resource Management under Mike Casella will be putting that together as a comprehensive AID budget, which will be then transferred to the Deputy Secretary of State and the Secretary of State for F to review and then incorporate into the larger OMB budget submission. You will be able to identify, though, the AID components in that budget as it moves forward. There is a commitment that AID will go over to OMB to argue for the budget, and then will be involved in the process as it moves ahead to the Hill. So this is going to be in effect as of FY13, which is obviously the next budget we're going to be working on, but the details are indeed in the document itself. Page 127, bottom of the page to the right.
I'll just add one thing on that from the state perspective, which is that the Director of Foreign Assistance... Her mic's not on. I'll add one thing from the state perspective, that the Director of Foreign Assistance has now become the Director of Foreign Assistance Resources, who reports up through Deputy Secretary Liu, and who will work very actively together with the head of the Aid Budget Office. Indeed, they have worked all of this out over the past 10 months.
Sure.
I'm sorry, the former Deputy Secretary Liu.
Jeremy Cadden with Congresswoman Shelley Berkeley's office. I know that political considerations never come into the Department of State's thinking or USAID, but given the premises we're on today, is there any consideration that has been given to the electorate's decisions in November, either in writing or in implementing? Thank you.
Absolutely. Although in this one, I have to say, I just think we were way ahead of the curve. It may be that if you wait long enough to release it, you're ahead of what's coming now. But you know, if you look at a lot of the statements of people who are coming in, you know, they're talking about how we actually both get results above all, and how we streamline and how we work better. And those are all the questions the Secretary asked. And she, as I started, she comes at this from the perspective of a senator who really believes we have to justify what we're asking for, and we have to do that not just on an annual basis, but on a 4-year basis. So all the way through, we are absolutely prepared to answer all those questions and to say that's what we've been doing for 18 months, and we have got a blueprint going forward. But also, there are places we need additional resources, but a huge amount of this we can do and are already doing at Aid and starting to do in various places in state, and we will do moving forward. And the final thing I'll say is civilian power is not just rhetoric. I mean, I'm quite serious that if you look at the full total, sum total of what we do in a particular country, which of course there's traditional foreign assistance and the various programs the State Department runs, but there are countless programs that other agencies are actually engaged in that we do not pull together in terms of how we advance our foreign policy objectives. You're not going to this doesn't mean politicizing everything. It doesn't mean you're going to subordinate either development or health or economic assistance to a specific political goal, but it does say when we think about our foreign policy, there is a lot that we can improve and actually increase our power just with what we have already.
If I can follow up on that, our view is that much of what we're talking about here actually will save resources, both for AID, but also for our government as a whole. When we talk about bringing procurement back into the State Department, back into USAID.
I'm okay, but you're
old habits. Back into AID, what we're actually going to be doing is saving money. It doesn't look like that because, in fact, we are going to have to hire some new people. But the actual budgetary cost of outsourcing is often more expensive. The other point that we're trying to make is that if you apply a little more civilian resources, all it takes is saving one situation where you have to intervene militarily, and the benefits are just dramatic. Similarly, we are trying to implement systems now that show the effectiveness of our results. We are about to launch a new monitoring and evaluation policy in January that's been put together by literally the world expert on monitoring development results, and that'll be in place in January. Additionally, one of the things that the Secretary said was transparency, transparency. And we are launching, or it may even be launched, what's called a dashboard on the State Department and USAID website, where you can go in and see every single contract that's been negotiated, where it is in the process, what its purpose was. It is remarkable document, and it's available for, and it's very manipulable, so that you can search for anything you want to search for. It's truly a remarkable document. And I apologize, but I have to go off to a Deputies Committee meeting on Sudan. So
you don't
thank
have your priorities correct. That's it. You should be staying here and persuading people.
I apologize.
Let me ask one more sentence just on the point about prevention, and again, it's easy to say it's less tangible, but General Petraeus was talking to the Secretary this morning about he's extremely supportive of this approach. This is the Department of Defense's approach going forward, and he will be, and other people in the Defense Department will be arguing exactly for needing to do this together.
Okay, other comments from staffers? Congressional staff? Well, I'll open it up if there are. Go ahead, sure.
Former congressional staff. How does public diplomacy fit into this strategic plan?
Thank you for the question. If everybody would just be planted to ask me about some different section of the report, we could go all afternoon. This is, as I said, there's a whole, one of the major chunks of the report is on engaging beyond the state. And the first part of that endorses Undersecretary McHale's entire new strategy for public diplomacy, which she in turn worked out parallel with the QDDR process, but that really starts from the proposition that this is about much more than messaging. It's about actually engaging and building relationships. So and she's already made reforms like having a new Deputy Assistant Secretary for public diplomacy to mainstream this in terms of what we do. We embrace everything she's done, and then we go further to say, this isn't just for the public affairs officers. Our expectation of every diplomat, again, we're talking to the foreign service officers who have come in and who are coming in to say, we, of course, expect you to analyze and write cables, but we expect you to be running programs, to be holding conferences, to be bringing together the people who are in a particular country with our NGOs, our businesses, our foundations, creating actually what we call collaborative networks to advance issues, and to then, of course, we then benefit from having those networks. So there's a big part on public diplomacy, and that's really embedded in a larger section that in some ways really reinvents how we think about what diplomats do going forward.
Let's open it up. Steve, Landy in the back, briefly.
I'll be very brief. I've been in trade policy.
You've got to identify yourself.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I've been in trade policy since Tokyo around 1973, but John Sewell has been in aid policy perhaps as long or even longer. You've seen so many reorganizations. I think it'll be very interesting to get your view on this particular reorganization if you want. And my second question is very short and to the point. I focus on Africa. I see an unbelievable threat coming from China and coming from the European Union with their economic policy agreements. What I hear in this description is a very good functional approach, which emphasizes all the functions which you have described and so on. How will we be able to then say, Africa is a unique challenge to us, so let's try to get an African approach? What role will the assistant secretaries be able to play in terms of a coordinated approach? Thank you.
You want to
You
answer
don't want
that
to
part?
tell. You don't want to tell them that this reorganization, unlike all previous ones, is going to totally transform everything we do. I think that would be a great answer.
Well, I'm showing my age here because I was around for the '73 one, and what is remarkable about this is everybody's bought into it, and I think it's true of Congress too. Although you may want to speak to that already. There's been a lot of consultation. Many people, including myself, have argued for a long time that development's not going to be taken seriously until it's got an equal place at the table. This is an equal place at the table, and although I've only seen the PowerPoint presentation, a lot of it makes a lot of sense. The trick is going to be in implementing it and getting everybody to play within this framework. And my guess is that this is a more propitious moment for doing that than at any time that I can think about for a long, long time. Because these halls are littered with congressional committees reforming the foreign aid program that never got taken up by any administration. This is a remarkable document, and anybody who's interested in either of these issues should be taking it very seriously to make sure that it gets implemented and funded in the right way.
Thank you.
Talk about Africa.
I'll talk about Africa. I will add, though, that it is, we all say that, come on, just moving the boxes on the org chart doesn't change anything. I actually think that's a little too glib. In fact, where you house something bureaucratically and who has incentives to work with whom and under whom is how you build human capital around issues you care about. So if you didn't have a G Bureau, we would not focus on global issues, and we might be able to do a much better job of that. There's always ways to reform, but this is really Secretary Clinton also looking at this and saying, if we create these undersecretaries, we create these bureaus, we are locking in perspectives, attitudes, approaches, policies that we want to lock in by building it into the bureaucracy. So I agree that it's hard, but people are ready to go January 1. The two undersecretaries are already making plans of how they do things. On Africa, there's a part of the report I didn't talk about enhancing our ability to work regionally. And I will be the first person to say I suspect that the next QDDR will take on this issue in an even bigger frame. There are plenty of reports talking about how we ought to have an equivalent to the COCOMs, or we should have offices that are really like the COCOMs. We can't go that far. There were proposals to move the assistant secretaries overseas. We're not going to do that either. But we really have put in place some concrete reforms, things as seemingly minor but important as giving the PDAS in every bureau the portfolio for regional and multilateral issues, meaning that the top deputy assistant secretary has to start thinking regionally in terms of regional organizations. In Africa, that's very important. If you are working through the African Union, if you're working through thinking about economic integration in Africa or ECOWAS, you want to be thinking regionally. Then we're also trying to improve our ability to think strategically regionally. And this sounds odd. We're organized as regional assistant secretaries, but those bureaus are all through the country desks. It comes up bilaterally. We don't start by saying, what's our strategy toward Africa as a whole? And we're changing that ability. But then we're doing something very practical that I think could have a lot of impact. We're creating regional circuit riders. So if you are focused, say, on economic integration, to take one important issue in Africa, if you are focused on women, if you are an expert in public-private partnerships, and we have not begun to tap the potential of public-private partnerships in Africa. We're never going to spend the money China does, but if we were thinking much more strategically about how we engage all the companies that see Africa as a growth area, we would have a lot more capability to influence what we're doing. If you're expert in those things, you'll be based at a regional hub. That might be Nairobi. I don't know where it would be. And you will travel around the different embassies. You'll be a regional circuit rider. And what that means is you will see across the different embassies. You'll cross-fertilize. You'll start thinking, hey, what could we do, not in all of Africa, but in subparts of Africa, on these kinds of initiatives that I think will give us a lot more purchase.
We've got time for one or two more questions. Yes, in the back.
Hi, Christina Talarico. I work for a senator, but I'm asking this question on a personal basis. Do you foresee preparing a short, maybe 4 or 5 page summary of what you guys can do on your own versus what you're asking Congress to do?
Yes, we actually, it's great. We have done that. I'm glad you're asking me that right now because we have the list. But you're right, in terms of fact sheets that we're preparing, we could actually do that one, I think.
Why don't you drop your card off with one of us? We'll make sure she gets it so you will see them when they come. One more? All right. I want to thank Anne Marie Slaughter for being with us. As you can hear from the buzzing of her phone or her BlackBerry, she leads a harried life. I was thinking about starting off this session saying, well, we're waiting for Godot. My impression from listening to you, which didn't come through in the PowerPoint, is that Godot may have arrived. And the trick is to keep him alive, if I can put it that way. So we thank you very much. And
Great.
we thank you very much for your role in the Woodrow Wilson Center Board because
Thank you.
it's been extremely valuable.
Thank you. Well, let me thank all of you. Do not rely on the PowerPoint. It's changed quite a bit, and it was just an early PowerPoint. So do go to the executive summary at the very least, and I hope you'll read the report. But let me end where I started. It has been a pleasure to work with the Woodrow Wilson Center, and even though my official engagement will end, my personal engagement will not.
No, good.